I'm delighted to be joined by Senator Ron Wyden, who is the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, which is jurisdiction over trade and tax and healthcare. So your life is really boring these days, Senator.
Not for the faint-hearted.
So I do want to, before we get into deep into manufacturing, I do want to jump into the news of the day, which is we've seen some movement from House Republicans on basically gutting the clean energy tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a key part of your legacy. What's it like watching it being murdered in broad daylight?
Well, this is always not about the candidate or the elected official. This is about whether it makes sense for Oregon and the United States' economic future. And this is, for example, going to make it harder to reshore clean energy operations. And whether it's critical minerals, whether it's batteries, whether it's solar or wind, I think that's a mistake, because what the House is voting to do is to raise energy prices and reduce clean energy jobs. I think that's a mistake, and we got a long way to go. We're also going to fight hard for what I call technology neutrality. I wrote that years ago because nobody knows what the big carbon reducers are going to be 30 years from now. Let's encourage science. We got Joe Manchin on that. We're going to keep trying to build bipartisan support.
It does seem like there's been some pushback from Senate Republicans on getting rid of these clean energy tax credits. Are you talking to them? Are you hopeful that these will be preserved?
I'm talking to them continuously, and a number of them, even in their comments last night, talked about the effect of manufacturing in communities that have been so hard hit. I mean, we wrote this bill because we knew that a lot of areas in the South, for example, in the West, had been so hard hit, they really hadn't had a chance to join the innovation revolution in terms of clean energy, manufacturing, and more jobs. They're not going to be happy about what went on in the House yesterday.
So just to talk about reconciliation a little bit more broadly, I mean, it does...
We call it like prolonged root canal work.
I mean, it does seem like there's a lot of tensions, infighting, a lot of pain, to your point. Do you think that they'll actually be able to get this across the finish line with just Republicans? And if not, do you think there's a pathway for some sort of bipartisan bill for extending the tax?
I'd love to do something bipartisan. I mean, Jason Smith and I, he's the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. We got 357 votes last Congress on a bipartisan effort, and I wish we'd done it because that would have laid the opportunity to do something again. So yes, I do think it makes sense to try to find some common ground.
Do you think that that will be necessary? I mean, do you think Republicans actually can reach a deal just on a party line vote?
Well, they're ultimately going to say, look, we don't want to blow it. But there sure seems to be a big difference from Chip Roy, who's been talking about how this is somehow going to become a $20 trillion bill. He doesn't want to be for it. And the Republican moderates who are making it clear that they loathe these Medicaid cuts. So they got a lot of turf they got to deal with at the next step.
Yeah. What about a debt ceiling vote? If things sort of extend out to where we're getting in the danger zone, do you think Democrats would support just raising the debt ceiling on its own?
That's not a one-sentence kind of answer. Obviously, this factors into a whole host of issues. At some point, you've got to pay your bills, and it's better to try to pay them up front rather than later. I think that's going to be a challenge as we look at the price tag on the Republican bill, because if what they're doing is basically spending a lot of money to create new tax breaks for billionaires, they're going to have to take the lead in terms of paying for it.
So one more question on the debt before we jump into tariffs, because I want to leave plenty of time for that. It does seem like the Democratic Party stance has been to spend money in order to achieve its economic objectives, right? To boost the middle class, to boost manufacturing. Do you think, given the trajectory of the debt, that maybe the Democratic Party needs to shift its messaging?
Well, first of all, I think Democrats, for the most part, have been much more interested in pay-as-you-go than the Republicans have. Remember, the Republicans now are talking about using fake math to justify their tax breaks. So we've never done anything like that. I was chair, now I'm ranking member. We've never done anything like basically saying you can make it up in terms of trying to come up with an opportunity to give more tax breaks to your pals, which in this case are the billionaires who are sitting with Donald Trump.
But do you think it's time to have a conversation about maybe in addition to raising taxes on some parts of the population, also cutting back spending?
I've always been, let's take healthcare, for example. People have said, so, Ron, what are you going to do about that? I said, we're going to go after the areas where there really is inefficiency and waste. And for example, upcoding has been a real problem in the healthcare field. This is basically where the insurance companies say somebody is sicker than they actually are to get bigger checks out of government. So yes, I think there are plenty of opportunities to show you're more efficient in these key parts of the economy.
So I did want to talk about trade. Plenty of news the last few months, weeks, days. On China, on Monday, there was a de-escalation between the U.S. and China, where now our tariffs, at least temporarily, on China have been lowered to an additional 30%. Is that low enough to restart trade? What are you hearing from ports and businesses in your state?
Here's what I hear from ports in Portland and Seattle, both of whom are not getting any ships coming in. We desperately need those ships in order to get the export, markets. But what my constituents want is to end this trade merry-go-round. And it goes something like this. Donald Trump threatens and he's going to go after people and he's going to be tough. Then he goes to a tariff that is outrageously high. He gets objections from his friends and allies, and then he basically backpedals, which he's done, twice. This means that, farmers and manufacturers and others can't get the main thing they want, which is some certainty and predictability. And that's why his tariff policies are so out of whack with the American people's interests.
But as he does pursue these talks, because it seems like now there's a start to negotiations with China.
Remember, he's negotiated in order to win a negotiation. He always talks about Xi and China. I don't think they've even had a phone call about these kinds of issues. At least I've never, read about it. We're going to talk, but the reality is today, Victoria, tariffs are 5 times higher than on the day that Donald Trump was sworn in. And what have we gotten for it? Virtually nothing.
So what my question was going to be, what would you like to get for it? I mean, when you think about China, there's so many potential asks, right? There's intellectual property theft, there's currency manipulation.
Stop right there. Go after both of those. We didn't have the Chinese say anything about intellectual, property theft. They're running wild in terms of stealing our assets, and there was no comment about that. This was essentially something where we walked away with no real, gains. We gave them a big break in terms of reducing the tariff that Donald Trump said he was so strongly in favor of. And I think that's what frustrates people, because they have no idea what's coming next. And he'll slap a pause on after he gets flack from his own friends. We read about that in the Washington Post today. That's not a trade policy.
So would it help certainty for the president to more clearly lay out what he is seeking from trading partners?
And what I can tell you, going back to Orrin Hatch, the late Republican, we always said there was an opportunity for bipartisanship in trade. USMCA was a good example, but why not make a kind of trade toolkit and include in there tariffs, which you can use when it really makes sense, rather than this across the board, we're just going to tariff everybody in sight. And tariffs are taxes, even though Donald Trump and his people won't often say it, and they hit middle-class people who are told their costs were going to go down, and they're not going down.
So on the trade toolkit, you and I were talking about 10 years ago when Congress passed Trade Promotion Authority, which is basically where Congress lays out its negotiating priorities for the administration, which now feels a little quaint.
To say the least.
Do you think that Congress should do something like that again to say, okay, President Trump, as you pursue these negotiations, here are the priorities that we at Congress think that you should pursue?
I think we ought to be consulting, with the role being Congress, as in Article 1, takes the lead on these kinds of matters. What we've had over the years is Congress give up too much leverage. Nobody thought Donald Trump would go this far. I thought we'd probably have some targeted kind of tariffs. But you bet, now we've got to get the executive branch recognizing what Article 1 is all about, with Congress in the lead.
And you also co-sponsored legislation that would peel back some of President Trump's authority to put these tariffs in place.
Absolutely, and you don't see Rand Paul and I on the same side every single day. But we said, look, this is not a close call. I mean, we told the American people we were going to lower their costs. These tariffs are raising their costs. We told them that we were going to reshore and get back in business in the United States, and now we've got Republicans and the president not doing anything about reshoring in terms of critical minerals and batteries and the like that can create clean energy jobs.
So what do you think it would take to get more Republicans on board with that effort? I mean,
I can tell you real quickly, I think it'll take some kind of outrage from the grassroots Republican base, and I think it's coming. I mean, they keep saying, well, we'll wait and see for this week or that week, but nothing opens a elected official's eyes like people revolting and saying, you told us you were going to lower costs. Donald Trump stood in that grocery line and said, I'm going to lower your prices in this grocery store, and people haven't seen anything like that. So I think it's going to have to be a big splash of cold water on folks in the Trump administration who will see that their trade policy is out of sync with what Americans, working families, and small businesses want, and that'll change things.
So you're saying once it feeds into prices, you think there will be a voter backlash, and then Congress might be more willing to act?
Think about what's on the front page of the paper this morning. Donald Trump basically responded with the second pause for one reason. He was getting flack from his base. He heard from some working families and some labor folks that have been aligned with him. He said, we're getting clobbered by this. He made that change according to what we heard in a pretty well-sourced article today was the reason.
Do you see any upside to the tariffs?
I see an upside into what I call targeted tariffs. If you look, for example, at a specific set of facts where you can say, we're going to focus on this, we're going to try and get that. Yes, I think a targeted tariff approach should be part of the trade toolkit. I'm not against a targeted tariff or something that says we're going to do something if it's warranted, but that's not what's going on here. Donald Trump calls himself tariff man. It looks like he kind of wants to get rid of taxes altogether and substitute tariffs for it. And to me, that sounds like Smoot Hawley. Hawley was from Oregon. I'm not going to be the next Hawley.
So the trade toolkit, what are the other tools other than tariffs?
Well, there's obviously negotiation. I mean, he's basically stiffed our allies for a big part of his so-called liberation period. That's what we tried to USMCA, is you find your allies, you look for places where it makes sense to move in a complicated economy, and particularly since Asia is such a big market, you start there.
So, there has been a lot of turmoil in markets in response to these tariffs. There's been a lot of, there's been a drop in sentiment among consumers, among CEOs. Why do you think Democrats haven't been able to break through more on messaging on this?
Well, Donald Trump works the Senate Democrats very hard. I mean, we basically were in a tie vote with Rand Paul and I in terms of getting an effort that would walk back the executive branch's role in trade, give the Congress a bigger role. We came very close. And I listened to a lot of the Republicans. You can see their expressions when they walked down, to vote. They were not very comfortable with that, but they said, okay, Donald Trump gets a little bit more time. I don't think they're going to give him much more, though.
And then I also wanted to ask about we talked about reconciliation, we talked about tariffs. I want to talk about how they dovetail. Do you think that tariff revenue is actually going to help as an offset?
So far, we've seen virtually none. I mean, we're waiting to hear about it. Remember, each one of these issues gets placed on that merry-go-round I described. I mean, think about what went on with Great Britain. I mean, Great Britain is like 2% of our imports. It is not as if the Brits are pillaging our economy and harming us from trying to reshore. I mean, this is kind of made up, and it was made up because he was looking for some good PR, and he wanted to say, everybody knows Great Britain, let's just say we're doing a deal with them. But there, with respect to that one big deal, or so-called, there's no there. It really isn't.
Because, I mean, trade negotiations do take a lot of time.
You think?
So, I guess my question is, you've talked about targeted tariffs being part of the toolkit, right, for reshoring manufacturing. But it also seems like, the president's approach could work of, we're going to have these tariffs until, you negotiate, and we'll bring them down while we're negotiating. But it seems like the timeline for that is probably going to be
eons.
I was going to say years. but perhaps eons. So I guess, do you think that there's low-hanging fruit where the president's approach could work? Like, are there countries, sort of like the UK, where
Well, the
we
ball
already
game, Victoria, the ball game is Asia, and particularly China. And the president keeps saying that this has been accomplished and that's been accomplished. And again, there's very little there. I think in terms of the actual takeaways, in terms of China thus far, China got the reduction in their tariffs. And what did we get? Essentially nothing.
So since this is a manufacturing event, I take it that you don't think that the tariffs will be very effective in reshoring manufacturing, although you can push back on that. What do you think would be most useful in terms of bringing back manufacturing?
Well, I'll give you an example. Let's say with the tax code, let's make it more attractive to do business in the United States than to do business overseas. For example, Pfizer paid essentially no federal income taxes in 2019, despite having a huge number of sales in the United States. That's because the tax code basically favors them for tax purposes setting up shop overseas. Let's change the tax code in an area that really incentivizes reshoring and lets us get ahead.
And if we do reshore some of these industries, how do you ensure that that actually leads to more employment rather than just automation? Or is that not the goal? Is the goal just for national security purposes, we want to make sure we make some stuff here, and if it creates jobs, great, but the more important thing is just having it here?
I can tell you, battery facilities like in my state are actually putting people to work, high skill, high wage jobs. I think it's a winner for the American economy, both short and long term.
And then, we talked at the outset about, the IRA, clean energy tax credits. There's also chips. Do you think that the Republicans will actually defend those things? And do you think those things are working?
Yes, they're off to a very strong start. I mean, chips are the foundation of a modern economy. And so Donald Trump wants to trash everything that was done in the Biden administration. There are some winners here, and one of them is our chips effort. Yes, we can strengthen the reshoring kind of component, but we're doing very well in terms of building a model, and we shouldn't disrupt it.
How often do you talk to Leader Thune?
He was on the Finance Committee. In fact, he still stays on. I talk to him frequently. He and I both went to school on a basketball scholarship, so that's a little bit about our shady past.
Do you see any sort of, does he agree with you on tariffs? Do you think that when you talk about the things that are important to you?
I'm not going to put words in the mouth of the majority leader, but do I believe, left in his own devices, that he would go a different route, a more USMCA model, which, I mean, the thing about USMCA is senators of both political parties who had essentially never voted for trade agreements in the past voted for it. And I think that over the years, the Finance Committee has built a kind of bipartisan coalition that allowed us to say, we're going to build things here, we're going to make it here, and we're going to ship it out around the world because people love buying American. That's what reshoring and creating the incentives here at home is all about.
Yeah, and you mentioned Rand Paul earlier. He seems to be the most vocal.
We're the Ben Franklin caucus. Ben Franklin said anybody who gives up their liberty to have security doesn't deserve either, and we're the Ben Franklin caucus.
Do you think do you expect other voices to start joining sooner rather than later?
Well, remember, we probably would have won the big vote if everybody was around. Mitch McConnell, for example, has long been an opponent of these tariffs. So I think we continue to build support. And again, Victoria, maybe we're probably getting close to the end, but I think political change rarely starts at the top and then trickles down today. I think it's always the other way around. It starts at the grassroots level and basically then makes its way to state capitol buildings. They're hearing about it. Remember, most of them have canceled their town hall meetings. I've had 17 town hall meetings already, and I go to places where Donald Trump got 70 or 80%, and people want the tariff policy changed.
Well, unfortunately, I think that's about all the time we have, unless you have one final thought you want to add on.
No, I would only say that normally a ranking member or a chair gives a closing address. I'm going to spare you such torture because I appreciate Politico and Victoria and having this program. Let's put this in the to be continued department.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Senator.
Thank you.